Good evening, everyone. You're in the right place at the right time. This is Coast to Coast AM, blasting out of the Mojave Desert like a Scirocco, blazing across the land, into your town, into your home, slamming into your radio like a supercharged nanoparticle of unobtainium. Greetings from the boldest, bawdiest, most outrageous city in the world, the planetary capital of sun, fun, sin, sex, and secrets, my not-so-humble hometown, Las Vegas, Nevada. My name is George Knapp, your occasional host, designated driver of the airwaves, and moderator of tonight's upcoming cavalcade of conversation. Welcome to spring, everyone. Here in the desert, we had a brutal winter. Lasted about a week, I think. Got down into the 50s one time. Brr. And I'm trying not to rub it in because I know so many of you are still buried under several feet of snow, still shivering and cold and rain and wind. I'm just saying, sure was a weird winter here. In fact, no winter at all. The West really needed a winter, too. While many of you are all still under an avalanche of snow, we've had so little up in the high country, and it means another parched summer and fall ahead, more drought, more fires, farmers going under, food prices going up. Thank goodness there's no such thing as climate change, right? Otherwise, I'd say we have reason to be worried. And yes, that's me being sarcastic. As you know, I'm not usually here on Saturdays, but I'm very happy to be sitting in the big chair tonight and tomorrow, as well as next Saturday and Sunday. I don't think I've ever done 4 coast-to-coast programs in 1 month, so I'm hoping you don't get too sick of hearing my voice on the weekends. We'll try to keep it interesting for you. I know we have various and assorted listening parties out there tonight because I've already heard from some of you, a couple of truckers there in the Rockies, a few of you huddled in a cabin in the wilds of Alaska, and that wild bunch at the Honky Tonk in Joshua Tree, and I've got my eyes on all of you. Tonight, a double header of intrigue and suspense, cults and cover-ups, murder and mayhem without absolution or satisfaction, big questions about police ethics, and a smattering of alleged devil worship and satanic ritual thrown into the pot as well. In the second half of tonight's program, I am joined by a brilliant aerospace journalist and famed test pilot. Bill Scott has been my guest in the past on this program to talk about secret airplanes, secret military bases, mysterious stuff flying around up there in the wild blue. Tonight, though, he returns to the program to address something much more somber, much more personal. We're coming up on the 5th anniversary of a terrible tragedy in the Scott family, something that hit very close to home for my upcoming guest, the shooting death here in Las Vegas of a young man with a very bright future, Eric Scott, Bill's son. Bill Scott calls it murder by cop, and he's been working hard to keep the story of his son's death in the public eye, to highlight what he sees as an epidemic of police shootings. We've read a lot about police use of force in recent times. It's been all over the news, but we're not going to cover the same stuff you've heard on other talk shows or news programs. Writer, test pilot, and heartbroken father Bill Scott joins me in Hour 3 of tonight's programming. But first, one of the most disturbing and still mysterious crimes any of us will ever hear of, a vicious murder committed inside a Catholic church establishment, an elderly nun strangled, stabbed multiple times, and then violated in a ritualistic manner that still haunts those who knew her. The main suspect, shockingly, was a priest who was not charged with the crime until 23 years after the nun was murdered. Did the church use its influence with police to avoid yet another scandal involving one of its priests? And was this priest part of a larger group of Satan worshippers and child molesters? The person who knows the case better than almost anyone is the journalist who covered the murder trial of the priest. David Yankee wrote the definitive book about the slaying and the aftermath. It's called Sin, Shame, and Secrets. And now he's out with a new, updated edition with fresh information and the latest developments. It is an immensely compelling book, but it's absolutely creepy because of the subject matter. David is making his very first coast-to-coast appearance in just a few minutes from now. Webmaster Sean and I have put together our usual assortment of odds and ends culled from recent headlines, newscasts, websites, birdcage bottoms, you name it. We call it Knapp's News, and you can check it out at your convenience on the Coast to Coast website. One item we've got posted there tonight about Mars One. You read about this project. Supposedly 200,000 people have volunteered to make this one-way trip to Mars. Die on the red planet. Really? Also, the EPA has finally weighed in on the subject of chemtrails, alleged chemtrails. They've issued this namby-pamby statement that is not likely to quell many suspicions. We've got that and more under Naps News on the Coast website. While you're on the website, check the section that mentions how you can become a Coast Insider. For pennies a day, you can listen to programs like tonight's program anytime, day or night, along with accessing a vast library, a vast archive of previous programs, all at your fingertips and at your convenience. With that, let's get to the good stuff. You all know the drill. Bring in the dog and cat, put on a pot of joe, toss a log onto the fire, and jump into those jammies and slippers. But before you do, maybe check the lock on the door. Make sure the chain is attached too, because the journey we're about to take is not one that will make you feel safe and secure in your home. It's about to get kind of creepy. Time for our first break. I'm George Knapp. We'll be right back with a murder story that will chill you to the bone. Here's on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back to the program. Sister Margaret Ann Paul devoted her life to her faith. She always knew she wanted to be a nun, even from a young age, and that's the path she followed, living a long life of piety, chastity, and charity as a nun in Toledo, Ohio, helping the poor and the sick. On April 5th, 1980, Holy Saturday, the day before Easter, she was murdered inside the chapel at a hospital where she lived and worked, strangled, stabbed more than 30 times, and violated in an almost unspeakable manner. Journalist David Yankee was assigned to cover the story some 23 years after the murder. He's written a gripping account of a gruesome crime, a botched investigation, and what sure looks like an alleged conspiracy involving the church and the police. The book is called Sin, Shame, and Secrets. A new paperback edition has just been released and updated almost to the day. It's a gripping story. David, welcome to the program.
Hi, George. Thank you for having me.
I saw the note that you published on a website or blog site explaining you were going to be on the show in the middle of the night, and I can assure you, you're in good hands here. It does seem counterintuitive to be talking about anything for a couple of hours in the middle of the night, but our audience is glad to have you here.
Oh, well, thank you. I know your show is hugely popular and has a lot of listeners, so I'm really honored to be on here. Thank you.
Sure. Now, you were a religion reporter, and had you ever been assigned to cover a murder under that umbrella, being a religious reporter before this one?
Well, no. I'd been a journalist for many years and had covered murders before, but since I switched to the religion beat, I never expected it to fall under that category. So I was quite shocked when the case first developed.
I mean, I guess I read somewhere that there has one other murder case in American history involving a priest, but never one where the victim is a nun, right?
That's right. Yeah, I've been researching this case for 13 years, and that's the only time that a priest that I can find that a priest has been charged with killing a nun, never mind convicted.
Had you paid much attention to the story, the case, prior to being assigned to cover the trial?
Well, the murder happened in 1980, and I came to Toledo in 1981. So it was like a year later, and people talked about it a little bit in the newsroom, but it had kind of died down. There was no arrest made, and so I really didn't pay much attention to it until the day of the arrest. And it was kind of interesting because a police reporter came over to my desk and said, do you know this Father Gerald Robinson? And I said, well, a little bit. I know he's speaks Polish and kind of a quiet guy. I said, why? She goes, I think he's going to be arrested. And I said, arrested for what? And she goes, for murder. And I was like sitting at my desk. I almost fell out of my chair. So that started it all right there.
Was that a tough assignment? I would think that it would be highly competitive, that the crime reporters would want to snatch onto it. And how is it that you landed it?
Actually, that's a good point, George. Most religion editors or religion reporters at the time, they had been writing kind of fluffy stuff and leaving the investigative reporting to the other departments. But I had a background in news investigating, and the religion beat changed in the early 2000s after 9/11, and all of a sudden, Islam was front page news, and people wanted to know all about it, and then in January 2002, the clerical sexual abuse scandal started in Boston, and that kind of rippled across the country with more revelations coming out. So, I kind of used my background as a news reporter and combined it with the religion beat, and kind of picked up on it, and my editors were supportive.
Yeah, I get the feeling just reading the book that you're not a cheerleader for religion. You're covering it like a news story.
Right, yeah. In fact, that was a transition time, and I'm a member of the Religion News Writers Association, and, a lot of people were kind of getting out of the beat at that time because it was turning into something that, was a little bit uncomfortable for them. But, I really felt it was important to, to cover the hard news as well. So, it was a different time for religion writing.
Maybe as a starting point for our conversation, as an overview, why should we still care about this case? How does it speak to larger issues and a larger audience?
Well, there's a lot of factors involved here. For one, murder is the most heinous crime, and it was a brutal murder involved here. And then the church and the police department conspired to protect the priest from being arrested. So the power of these institutions to prevent justice from being carried out is really disturbing, and I think we need to be on guard to know that these things did happen, they do happen, and what can we do to prevent it? And I think awareness is the starting point.
Well, let's start with Sister Margaret Ann. Tell us about her. She comes across as very straight. She walks the walk, talks the talk, but she was a tough cookie, I guess.
Yeah, she grew up in a rural area, western Ohio, farm country, and went away to become a nun at an early age, and then she rose through the ranks to become the head of several hospitals. So she was running multi-million-dollar operations. She was very small, she was 5'1", but she was she took charge. She ran those hospitals, and she made sure everything was in order, and she was very demanding. There's a part in the book where the housekeeper said that the nun was waiting for her one day when she came to clean the convent, and chewed her out for throwing away scraps of soap when she said you can push them together and make one big bar out of these little scraps, and you're taking the toilet paper off the rolls when there's still a few pieces left. You need to save money here and be more careful with how when you're cleaning up. So the housekeeper was kind of shocked, but that's the way she was. She ran a tough ship.
You had mentioned that earlier in her career she had administered big operations. She had a lot of people under big budgets, but she had transitioned into something else. What was she doing at the time? What were her responsibilities at the time of her death?
Well, she was the sacristan of this Mercy Hospital, which is a Catholic hospital near downtown Toledo. And the sacristan's job is to prepare the chapel for Mass. So, she would basically make sure all the priest's vestments were ready, that the candles were there, that, the wicks were trimmed, and everything was in order. All the communion hosts and the wine and the chalices were all ready for Mass. And, she, at the time of her death, she was 71, and in fact, she was killed the day before her 72nd birthday. So she was kind of semi-retired. She was no longer running a hospital, but she took her job very seriously and, really wanted to serve God as best as she could, and she saw that as an important role, and she took it very seriously.
In the beginning of the book, you have sort of a step-by-step account of what happened on that day, and I think you've reconstructed it from a variety of different sources, but it is really kind of gripping. Why don't you share with us the sequence of events, leaving out the part about who was responsible? We'll get to that part later. Sure.
Well, it was disturbing, and, a lot of this was not fun to write about, but it's all factual, and I maybe used a little bit of filling in some dialogue and things like that, but this is all from police accounts and police reports, and nobody was at the murder scene, but the forensics and the pathologists all reconstructed it. So basically, what happened was Sister Margaret Ann Paul had been in the sacristy preparing the room. It was Holy Saturday morning, the day before Easter, and over that Holy Weekend, the services are a little bit different. They don't have a mass, but they have a service in the chapel, and so she was in there preparing the candles and the altar for Holy Saturday service, and while she was in there, now she was hard of hearing, which as she was getting older, her hearing was getting worse and worse. So she was in this room by herself early in the morning. She got up at 5:30 and had breakfast and went down to the chapel in the sacristy. While she was in the room, somebody came up from behind and put a cloth around her neck and pulled the cloth so tight that it broke 2 bones in her neck. And so she wasn't strangled to death, but she was comatose, and she was knocked out. The perpetrator then laid her body on the floor of the sacristy, which was a terrazzo floor, and covered her with an altar cloth, which is significant, and we can talk about that. Then he placed a crucifix or a cross on her chest in an upside-down inverted cross, stabbed around the cross 9 times in a perfect upside-down cross shape, stabbed her in the left side of the chest, then took the altar cloth off, stabbed her 22 more times in the chest and neck and face, and then he took the murder weapon and he touched it in blood and anointed her forehead with her own blood. He then pulled her habit up over her chest and pulled her undergarments down to around her ankle. And then he wasn't quite done yet. He apparently, according to the autopsy, he penetrated her with some object. The police believe maybe it was the crucifix that had been on her chest, and then left her there in that sacristy behind a locked door, and walked out of the room. And her body was discovered later by one of her fellow sisters.
Man, you think about that number of stabbings, more than 30 times stabbing someone, and I know right off the bat you kind of discuss possible reasons for that, and they develop them further in the book, but the idea that it might be just blind rage for somebody to do it that many times, or there was some other agenda at work there. What do you think?
Right. Well, one of the thoughts was, it was somebody who was just really furious and out of control, and the other one was that, they wanted more blood for a ritual. A ritual sacrifice, blood is very important, and when the killer had strangled her almost to the point of death, but not quite, her heart was barely beating, so it wasn't pumping much blood. And in order for the ritual, if that's indeed what it was, it's one of the leading theories of the reason for the murder. In order to get more blood for the ritual, he continued to stab to try and get more blood to flow.
You include some dialogue there, and as you just mentioned, you sort of took some liberties in making it up. Not in making it up, but it's based on what you think might happen in a ritualistic type slaying. Was there testimony about that later? I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, but was there any testimony to that effect of what somebody might say in that kind of a situation?
Not in the trial, but I did talk to an exorcist and also an expert on ritual killings or ritual violence, and they both kind of went over some of the practices that are found in rituals and some of the things that a ritual mass or a black mass, what they might say. So I went with with what the experts say usually happens in these situations, and but yeah, the other thing is I talked about like what was going on in the killer's mind, and I talked to several detectives and police who have investigated a lot of murders, and they said there's a lot of times they say it feels like there's the killer will say it feels like there's a freight train running through their head. So they said that's kind of a recurring theme. So I use that to kind of describe what the killer was thinking.
You know, leaving her clothing like that, leaving her exposed, it's just so ghastly and horrible. There was a lot of speculation about why the killer did that, maybe to throw the police off. We'll pick up that part of the conversation with my guest, David Younkie, right after this on Coast to Coast. The Beatles, Eleanor Rigby from 1966, take us into the break. One of the best from singer-songwriter Donovan, Catch the Wind, written in March 1965. Still sounds pretty good. We're talking with David Younkie, whose book, Sin, Shame, and Secrets, details one of the most gruesome murders of the 20th century, which became sort of a media sensation not once, not twice, but a couple of times, and fueled in part by the book that David wrote. When we come back, the focus shifts to the main suspect in this case, a priest. And we'll tell you the name and why he became the suspect right after this on Coast to Coast. David, before we return to specifics at the crime scene, could you sort of help me set the stage about Toledo, what Mercy Hospital, what its position was in the community, what Toledo was like then, and sort of in a larger context, the influence of the church in Toledo at that time?
Sure. You want me to do that on air or now?
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
Well, we're on the air, yeah.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Yeah, well, Toledo is a city where the Catholic Church has been very, like the dominant religion for many years. A lot of immigrants came here from Central Europe, Hungary, Poland, Germany, and brought, their Catholicism with them. And there was a lot of ethnic parishes in Toledo back in the, from the beginning of the 20th century until, actually going back to the 1890s. But anyway, Toledo is strongly Catholic. There's 325,000 members of the Toledo Catholic Diocese, and it covers 19 counties. But I would say that, a lot of the key leaders of the community, from police to, the judicial system to lawyers, a lot of them are Catholics. Things have changed after the clerical abuse scandal. The church isn't quite as powerful, but there was a lot of protection of the church. I mean, the police were told, and a lot of the detectives have told me this, that you will never arrest a priest. If there's ever any incident involving a priest, you call the bishop or call the police chief, and they'll handle it. So, the priests were considered above the law in many ways, even from the police themselves. A lot of them didn't like it, but that was their orders from above. So on Sunday mornings, they were told to, sit outside the parish and direct traffic and make sure nobody steals the offering and things like that. So no matter what else was going on in town, if there was a Catholic church in the police officers' area, they had to stay and hang out at the church and protect it.
I was amazed by that story. You tell it in the book about how, all right, this is sort of a standing order. If you're a cop, you're living in Toledo, you got a Catholic church in your neighborhood, you got to be there. You got to be there to direct traffic.
Yeah, that's right. That's your job, And I guess if there was an emergency, they might be allowed to leave. But standard procedure was, you stay at that church and make sure everything's okay on Sundays. So, there was just a great reverence for the church, a great respect, and a lot of power. One of the most powerful, people in the community is the bishop, and, there was a Monsignor here back in the day when the murder took place called Monsignor Schmidt, and he was responsible for a lot of things, including bringing the Toledo Mud Hens, to town, getting them a new stadium and things like that. So, there was a lot of wheeling and dealing and power brokers in the church itself. The prosecutor for Lucas County was a devout Catholic. The deputy police chief that was in charge of the murder investigation was a devout Catholic. He had 10 children and thought about becoming a Catholic deacon. The influence of the church just permeates the Toledo culture in many ways.
Mercy Hospital, tell me about that. A modern hospital, did good work, helped the community, helped the poor and the sick?
Well, it was a modern hospital. It's now closed, and it's now a teaching nursing college. But it was just outside the city limits. It was a relatively small hospital compared to some of the other ones in town, but they did emergency rooms and surgeries and things like that. It was they had 4 stories of the hospital, I think 7 stories for the some areas of the hospital. It's a pretty big building, and it was because of its location being close to downtown. They did deal with a lot of emergencies from the inner city. So it was not a. I don't mean to say it was a small hospital. There's just some mega hospitals around it, or further out.
Back to the crime. You described some of the details before the break about the clothing being her undergarments being pulled down to her ankles and her being left in such a sort of an exposed state. It almost seems for shock value. I know you speculate, or there was speculation in the book and over the years since that maybe it was meant to sort of distract police, to make them think it was primarily a sex crime. Where are you on that? What do you think about that?
Well, I've become convinced over the years that this was a ritual killing, and I believe that if you're going to mock God with such a brutal act and such a despicable act, and it was just like the final straw there to show that that you're angry at God and you're going to take it out on Him by disgracing this virginal servant of the Lord, a woman who dedicated her life to God. So, how much further could you degrade somebody, or could you mock, a holy divinity, a deity, than by, leaving her in such a horrendous state? For a nun, of all people to find her, would be a fellow nun. So just terrible, terrible thing. But I think it was just further evidence that the killer was just angry at God and trying to take it out on him.
You do describe sort of as the news ripples through the facility. It's mind-numbing of what that moment must have been like when the body is discovered by a fellow nun, and then bam, the news spreads like wildfire.
Yeah, the hospital had a system that they called they would make a call on a public address system called the Mr. Swift call, and that meant that there was an emergency, and they everybody was to drop everything, and just all the doctors were supposed to head to the designated area. So there was a call that there was a Mr. Swift call in the chapel, and the nun, Sister Madeline Marie Gordon, who found Sister Margaret Ann Paul's body. She was just totally hysterical and just screaming, and they could hear the screams. They were all on that first floor there where the chapel was, and there was a group of nuns and a priest, Father Swiatecki, Jerome Swiatecki, having breakfast in the nuns' dining room when they heard these hysterical screams, and then the Mr. Swift call. So a lot of people rushed towards the chapel and the sacristy to see what was wrong, and being a hospital, they wanted to, the medical personnel were there trying to help, but by the time they arrived, it was definitely too late.
And amazingly, there were 2 cops who were on the grounds.
Yeah, there were 2 policemen having breakfast. They were just finishing their night shift, and they were the first policemen to arrive on the scene, and it was clear to them that that it was a murder and that the victim was deceased. And actually, one of the detectives one of the officers that arrived first was Dave Davidson, who became a champion for Sister Margaret Ann Paul. He was convinced right from the get-go that this murder was covered up, and that there needed to be an investigation and to find the killer. So he went on over the years he went on a crusade, writing to the president, the attorney general, to the Pope, trying to get them to look into this case. And he also obtained a lot of the 1980 police reports through Freedom of Information Act. So here's a policeman. Well, he was retired by that time, but he was having to file FOI requests to get the police reports on the nun's murder.
And it was telling, too. You described this in the book. These 2 officers are on the scene. Other officers get called in. Detectives, homicide guys take over. But these 2 guys are already there, and instead of homicide guys talking to them, this is sort of a harbinger of things to come. They get a call that there is a black man at the bus station causing ruckus, and they send these guys away.
Yeah, they got them out of the way right away, and they weren't happy. They were there at the scene, and they felt like they could be helpful to the investigation, but the orders came from headquarters to send them down there, so they did, and so they were basically taken off the case, even though they were the first ones to arrive, which was kind of against protocol. But that's the way things were handled. As you said, it was a harbinger of things to come.
So right off the bat, the police start trying to narrow down a list of possible suspects. They're thinking maybe it was a stranger. Did a stranger wander into the hospital and then commit this crime and wander out? They got a list of all the names of people who work there, and they got dozens of names, and they quickly start whittling them down, right? But it comes down to just a couple of names that still, actually just one name that still remains on the list that can't be quite explained away. That name is Gerald Robinson. Who is he?
That's right. The police interviewed over 600 people in that first week, and they said that by the end of that first week, their only suspect, they said, was Father Gerald Robinson, a Toledo Catholic priest who had been working as a chaplain at Mercy Hospital. So he lived at the hospital. He had a small apartment there, and they quickly narrowed it down, and they felt like he was the only one that could have done it.
And what was it about him that made him a suspect? What factors put him on the top of the list?
Well, he had access to the chapel and the sacristy. The sacristy was typically locked. He could not explain his whereabouts on the morning of the murder. He said he never left his apartment until after everybody heard about the murder, and he got a phone call saying that a nun had been killed, and yet some people said they had seen him in the hallway near the chapel around the time of the murder. So there was that aspect of it, and then also they felt like that somebody was an insider there. There was nothing stolen. They had a gold-plated chalice and other valuables inside the sacristy. None of it was missing. So they quickly narrowed it down to people that were, had worked in the hospital or had access to the sacristy, and probably somebody who knew the nun.
You mentioned in the book, I forget which of the names of different people, different employees and church personnel who were there, who all seemed to, when asked who might do this, his name gets mentioned a bunch of times. Why was that? They just had a weird feeling about this guy?
Yeah, well, Dave Davidson, the police officer, said that as soon as the murder happened, he asked people, who do you think who could have done this? And he said all the employees said the priest or Father Robinson. He said it was just everybody's first response. And he was not really well liked at the hospital. He was kind of a quiet person. He kept to himself. Kind of cool, distant, aloof type of personality. He just was not a people person at all, and he just people just had doubts about him, suspicions about him. He didn't seem like the normal priest. And there was one other priest at the hospital who was working as a chaplain, and that was Father Jerome Swiatek, and he was like the polar opposite of Robinson. He was a people person, gregarious, hung out, talked to people. Robinson, he didn't want to be at the hospital. He told the bishop that he wanted to be transferred to become a military chaplain, and the bishop never transferred him. So, he was a disgruntled worker, I guess you could say, because he was a misogynist. I mean, it's pretty clear that he did not get along with women. He didn't like being around the nuns, and he liked to be. The priests normally are the bosses. They tell the nuns what to do. They're the leaders, and yet he was working in a hospital that was owned by a religious order of nuns, and the nuns were in charge, and so he resented apparently from what people told me. He did not like taking orders from the nuns, and so he was just not a happy camper there at Mercy Hospital.
And the day before the murder, apparently the victim had sort of chewed him out.
Right. Yeah, there was the Good Friday service, and it's unclear whether he had performed the service or if Father Swiatecki did. But at any rate, there was a witness said that Sister Paul confronted Father Robinson and said, "Why do you cheat what belongs to God?" Because he had the service had been cut short. So whether he did it himself or Swiatecki, he was the head of it. He was a chaplain, and Swiatecki was the assistant chaplain. So I guess the responsibility was his either way, whether he did it himself or had Swiatecki do it. But yeah, she was not pleased that the Good Friday service was not done to the fullest extent of what the Mass called for.
4 days after the murder, there is a funeral Mass held for Sister Paul, and in retrospect, in hindsight, it's almost obscene that Reverend Robinson presided over it or helped preside over it.
Yes, it's shocking, really. In fact, the first edition of my book, which is out of print, had that photo on the cover. It was kind of hard to grasp at first glance, and so it took a little explanation, so I don't think it really worked well as a book cover. But there's a photo of the funeral Mass. It was in Fremont, Ohio, at the Religious Orders chapel there. And Father Robinson is one of the priests that presided at the Mass, and Sister Margaret Ann Paul's casket was right in front of him, covered with a pall, and yeah, he was there performing the funeral. So, knowing that 26 years later he would be convicted of a murder, it's just it's incredible that he would have the audacity to be there at her funeral.
We're going to take a break in about 3 minutes. I'd like you to use this time to sort of give me the broad strokes of why the crime scene, why it seemed to be a ritualistic murder. I guess the date was part of it. Some of the circumstantial evidence had indicated it. I'm not Catholic. I'm not quite sure of the significance of Holy Saturday. I understand the relationship to Easter, but describe for me why Holy Saturday would be important for this kind of a crime if a ritual was in your mind.
Well, that's a good question, George. The whole weekend from Good Friday, actually the week leading up to Easter, is a very important week for Christians and Catholics. And on Good Friday, that's the day that Christians observe that Jesus was crucified and died on the cross. And so there's a very somber observance of that in the church, and they take the Holy Eucharist in the Catholic churches, which are normally stored in the tabernacle in the chapel or in the church itself, and they have a procession where they take it out of the main chapel and they put it away into the sacristy, because the Holy Eucharist is literally the body of Christ, according to Catholic teaching. So here they take the body of Christ out of the chapel and they put it in the sacristy, and then they take it back out on Easter, the day of the resurrection. So the only day of the year where the Holy Eucharist or the body of Christ is in the sacristy is on Holy Saturday, and that's the day that the murder occurred in the sacristy. So the presence of God was in that room, the literal body of Christ, according to Catholic teachings. So the murder was performed in front of God Himself. And it was performed on the holiest weekend of the Christian year, and on top of that, the nun had been covered with an altar cloth and then stabbed through the altar cloth. Now, according to an exorcist who testified at the wedding, a Catholic priest who was an exorcist, he said when the altar cloth is placed over the body, it literally turns the victim into an altar. So it was again a mockery of the holiest day, the holiest rituals of the Catholic Church, by turning the murder victim into an altar and then stabbing her with this inverted cross, which was a perfect shape of an inverted cross in her chest for the first 9 stab wounds.
So if you are, say, if you are a devil worshiper, if you're worshiping Satan and trying to make a mark with the big evil guy, doing this on this date inside of a facility like that, to a nun, you're marshaling some powerful forces.
Exactly. Whether it seems very outrageous, but that's the theory behind it. That if you're going to perform a ritual killing, and this is the most powerful time and the most powerful way and place that you could perform it, and there could be no victim more powerful for a satanic ritual than a virginal nun who had sacrificed her whole life.
David Younkie, author of Sin, Shame, and Secrets. When we come back, we're going to hear more about the troubled background of this prime suspect, priest named Gerald Robinson. In Excess takes us into the break here on Coast to Coast AM.